power plants, which, as Lynn mentioned, is I think, quite possibly going to be a major means of addressing or mitigating CO2 emissions. And I'll talk about a little bit about why I think that is the case. The specific sort of problem topic that I'm going to talk about with respect to CO2 capture is the integration of CO2 capture with renewables. And this is sort of, we think it's an exciting frontier area that I've been working on with student Charles Kang here for 2 years now. And we think it actually shows a lot of promise for improving the economics of CO2 capture and also potentially aiding the ability to shift renewables into the grid at the timescales that we want to move them into the grid. So for an overview, I'll talk a little bit about what I think of as the 2 key energy challenges facing the electricity system over the next half century or so. Again, this is sort of kind of 2050 time frame, not necessarily next year. I'll then talk about our concept of integrating fossil and renewable energy systems together, ideally, as we think, to make a system that works better than it would otherwise if you didn't integrate these 2 systems together. I'll talk a little bit about the optimization model that Charles has built, and he can answer, obviously, more detailed questions about that. I'll show some example results, and then we'll wrap up with some conclusions. As far as I can tell, being a sort of I guess a really reasonably informed observer of the electricity system, I think there are 2 challenges facing electricity over the next half century. The first one is reducing greenhouse gas emissions from existing power plants. The capital intensity of investment in the electricity system is such that, and the sort of the scales of investment required are such that it really is a decades-long problem. Perhaps the right way to think about this is that in order to build a power plant, you're talking a large, let's say a large coal-fired power plant, like many that have been built in the developing world over the last 10 years. You're talking investment on the scale of billions of dollars. And the sort of commonplace way to think about it is these come with a large mortgage, right? They come with a mortgage that is decades long. And actually this long operation lifetime is required to pay off the plant. And it's a fundamental part of the economics of the plant. So it's actually extremely difficult economically to just say we're going to turn off these coal-fired power plants. Older ones that will likely make sense. Newer ones, that's very difficult. And for this reason, many power plants that are operating today, particularly in other countries, have operating lifetimes of decades, economic operating lifetimes. And so the first challenge is sort of addressing greenhouse gas emissions from this inertial sort of built stock that we've got in the system that's going to take a very long time to filter its way through the system. The second one is integrating increasing fractions of renewable resources with the grid. This is something I'm sure you guys are going to hear about multiple times over the course of the week if you haven't already. This is something that's just now becoming a significant issue, but we think in the future is going to become more of an issue. The challenge here, of course, is that renewable generation is more uncertain than something that you can schedule with more certainty. This leads you to this requires you to have a little bit more flexibility about how you operate the grid. With the results now that some regions at some times currently now, for example, can't use all the wind power that's generated, so the wind power has to be spilled. And so this is an issue as the penetration of renewables grows. This will likely become a larger issue. So our question is there a way to address both of these sort of big challenges over the next century simultaneously? So our concept here is to optimally integrate CO2 capture with renewable power such that we can reduce the overall cost of capturing CO2, that is, make it cheaper to mitigate the climate damage, while also providing support for renewable systems. The justification here is that CO2 capture is quite energy intensive, requires a significant energy demand. We're talking on order a third of the energy content of the fuel, of the primary fuel. Secondarily, the timing of CO2 emissions is not important, right? So while flexibility is while the timing of electricity inputs and withdrawals from the grid is very important on a minute-to-minute time scale and even shorter, the atmosphere doesn't care so much if the emissions happen on Monday or on Tuesday, as long as averaged over the course of whatever time period you're concerned about, you reach a target. And so we think that flexibility in the capture rate can affect the cost of CO2 capture. And so our sort of a couple ways of thinking about the general concept is that the ideal CO2 capture system operates in sort of a totally flexible manner, such that the costs of CO2 are minimized by only capturing CO2 when it's cheapest to do so, right? So you push essentially all the CO2 capture to time periods when it's most least burdensome to capture the CO2. Obviously, there are trade-offs by, and we'll talk about that, by building in this variability, you actually increase the cost of the system, so you can only go so far. But ideally, your CO2 capture would be this sort of variable sponge that as the effective cost of capture increases and decreases, you're capturing more or less. Another way to think about this is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to transfer variability from a system that's very intolerant to variability or unpredictability, that's the electricity grid, to a system that is very buffered over sort of human timescales, weekly, monthly, seasonal cycles. And that's the atmosphere, right? And so we're sort of playing off that degree of flexibility. We're looking at trying to meet two standards in this research. So these act as constraints in our system. The first one is that California requires, as of a couple of years ago, that any long-term power purchase contracts for supplying power to the state of California have a CO2 intensity less than or equal to 500 kilograms per megawatt hour. This is on order like a natural gas plant. And so obviously a coal-fired power plant, you're going to have to capture the CO2. That amounts to about half the CO2 intensity of a normal coal-fired power plant. The other standard is a renewable portfolio standard. California has a 33% renewable target by 2020. And so our goal is to sort of move forward and help try and meet both of these standards at once. Here's a simple diagram of our system. We've got a coal-fired power plant at the top that's sending electricity. We've got our lightning bolt here out to the grid. And then we're also sending flue gas to this box here, which is the CO2 capture system. Supplementary to that, we have a gas turbine it's quite flexible. You can ramp it up and down. That's combined with a heat exchanger that generates steam that's used to regenerate the CO2 capture system. We also have the possibility to integrate wind into the system, either by directly selling it to the grid as part of what we're calling a blend. So that is, you would build a certain amount of wind turbines along with your coal-fired power plant to essentially get your aggregate CO2 intensity down. Or you can send wind to either a heat pump or sort of a direct electricity to heat system to generate heat at certain times. And I'll talk about when you might want to do that. This is a more detailed mass flow diagram of one sort of snapshot, instantaneous snapshot of where the mass is going in the system. And so you can see here that mass goes from the coal plant to the CO2 capture unit. Flue gas goes to what's called a heat recovery steam generator to generate steam, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of the level of detail at which we're modeling things. The framework in which we're operating, the optimization framework in which we're operating, requires that the model be fairly simple. It needs to be solved many thousands of times in order to optimize, and so you face a definite trade-off in these problems between increasing model complexity and the ability to get a stable, robust solution. And so it's relatively simple. Our objective function, so for optimizing, if you want to optimize, you need an objective function. This is basically something you're trying to maximize or something you're trying to minimize. Our objective function is to maximize sort of the daily operating profit of the system, which we're taking to be the value of the power sales. That is the value of the electricity you sell onto the grid, minus the fuel costs, how much you have to spend to purchase coal and natural gas. We don't currently include capital costs. That's what Charles has started working on a little bit this summer, and that's going to be the next year or so. It's going to be integrating capital costs into the model. Our decision variables, every optimization model has decision variables. So these are basically, if you're trying to maximize or minimize your objective function, the decision variable says, what do I have control over? So if I'm trying to maximize operating profit, what can I actually change in order to sort of choose an optimal setup? We can turn the gas turbine up and down, so you generate more and less electricity and more and less heat using that. You can change the CO2 absorption rate from the flue gas. You can use supplemental natural gas heating, and then we can, as I said, take wind power to heat. And we'll talk about that actually in a second. The business model that we're modeling is actually a Wyoming to California energy sales scheme. And so the idea is that there's a lot of coal power in Wyoming. There's a number of coal-fired power plants in Wyoming. There's also a lot of wind in Wyoming. And so the idea here is to blend these together and ship a low greenhouse gas blend to California. So we're using California electricity prices here in blue, along with Wyoming wind generation in green, and this is a sample day. So you can see here that these vary quite a lot. The electricity price in the middle of the morning at say 6 or 7 a.m. is very low. Wind power peaks in the evening. If you're imagining this, what we're calling our sort of heuristic base case, if you're imagining this combustion turbine like a normal, what's called a peaker plant, that is a gas turbine that comes on and off during the day, you might have a price threshold. And so let's say here our profit threshold is about $60 per megawatt hour. At that point, the CO2 capture rate, or the gas turbine partial loading is turned up. That allows you to instantaneously capture more CO2 far above this sort of background level that's performed at all the other times. And so this heuristic rule is capture a minimal amount of CO2 during the rest of the day, and then when it's profitable to run the gas turbine, turn the gas turbine all the way up and capture the rest of the CO2 that you need to meet the standard at that time. That's sort of our base unoptimized case. Our optimized case, this is the same left-hand side here, our input of electricity price and wind power, operates very differently. You can see here that the gas turbine is turned off in the middle of the night. The CO2 capture is turned off in the middle of the night. So basically, because there's no value to the power that you sell, that you sort of co-generate along with the captured CO2, why would you capture CO2 in the middle of the night, right? If you have a parasitic case where you're sort of taking energy off of the system, which is sort of the alternate modified system for capturing CO2, then you would not want to capture during the day when we need the power and capture it all at night, okay? You can see here also at times where the electricity price is very low and we still have some wind power. It actually makes sense to send some of this wind, basically suck this wind into the system that's not worth very much on the grid in order to capture the CO2. So in essence, we're sort of storing some of this wind power in the middle of the night by capturing extra CO2 during the night. That enables us to capture a little bit less during the day. So you can see here that this optimized framework, actually the behavior of the system is very different than what you might imagine from sort of the simplest kind of base case. The daily benefit of optimization varies a lot between days, and we can see that it varies with the amount of wind generation that's available on the grid, and also it varies with the average electricity price and actually the standard deviation of the electricity price, so how much electricity price varies over the course of the day. And we found, it's not shown on this axis, that as the electricity price is more and more erratic, you have a larger price difference between the middle of the night and let's say peak time at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It makes more and more sense to essentially shift this CO2 capture from one time period to another, and thereby reducing the cost of CO2 capture. What we're finding is that the mean improvement over all model days is about 18%. And the daily operating profit. And so basically you can significantly reduce the economic penalty, not necessarily the energy cost, but the economic penalty of CO2 capture by basically shifting when you do it and integrating it with renewables. This is something similar to what's been found, on orders similar to what's been found by a variety of researchers from the UK and from University of Texas and other people who are looking at similar sorts of systems. So I guess our conclusion is that we're thinking that you shouldn't think about fossil energy systems with carbon capture and storage and renewables as necessarily separate systems, because in all likelihood we're going to be using them simultaneously. We're going to have a grid with lots of renewables on it and with coal-fired power plants with carbon capture. They're going to potentially be operating at the same time for decades, and so we need to think about how to integrate these together. We think that the significant benefit that we're seeing for optimization suggests that there's enough room here to where we should explore it further. If you only see 3 or 4% benefit, then maybe you don't go further. But we're seeing significant benefits, so we're gonna continue with the research. And then we're moving forward with capital cost estimation and more realistic process modeling.